to file item 7, the lead scientist report. Dr. Goodwin. A busy science month, too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is that on? Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, members of the Council. Yes, it's been a very busy month for science as well. And I thought I would just start, actually, with your comment about the Independent Science Board. As you're aware, they're all internationally recognized scientists, and as nice things happen in other parts of their career, I thought you might like to know that. Of course, the Independent Science Board was just incredibly active in 2013, and we gave you that report of the number of written products and activities. So the thing that actually came across my desk a couple of weeks ago is that Dr. Joe Fernando last Friday was invited to travel to the University of Grenoble in France, where he received an honorary doctorate, which is the highest honor that an institution can bestow on a scientist from elsewhere. And what's very interesting, it's actually the Joseph Fourier University, which is the Fourier transform and the Fourier mathematics is what drives a lot of the models which are used across the Delta. So a very high honor for Dr. Fernando at the University of Notre Dame, and so perhaps when you see him on his next trip out, you might like to congratulate him. So the lead scientist report is broken into three areas here, and then I'd like to add a couple of other remarks of things that have come up since this was published. So under the science reviews, what's interesting this month is that here you've got three activities which are going on that really span the scope of the primary mechanisms which we have in the Delta Science Plan to develop the best available science. How do we anticipate and manage scientific conflict, and how do we ensure that the highest caliber of science gets to the agencies that need them? And so in these scientific reviews here, we've got everything from that was completed in a very short time frame, very rapid turnaround time, and I think the chair at the time, Chair Eisenberg, sort of asked us about when can science really be responsive. And so of these three activities here, the in-stream flow criteria methods review is actually an activity which was conducted at the request of the State Water Resources Control Board, where they needed information put together very quickly. And they asked the question, what's known about setting flow criteria, but both in the state and elsewhere? And with a short time frame that the State Water Resources Control Board have, we convened a panel that actually didn't meet in person. That they worked on their own, they communicated with each other through teleconference and other activities. It also had a very concise charge associated with it. And the report specifically focused on what has been implemented successfully in setting flow criteria elsewhere, particularly looking at one example here in the state of California, the state of Texas, and what they do in the state of Florida. And the idea is that this might give some ideas and direction to the State Board when they're setting the flow criteria in priority tributaries to the Central Valley. The panel chair that we selected for that was Cliff Dahm, the former lead scientist, and he came to present the findings of that panel to the State Board themselves. So Cliff, of course, has got extensive experience in the Rio Grande and other systems. There was also Sarah Yarnell from the University of California, Davis, who's been working on the Feather River here in California. And then there was Marty Kelly talking on behalf of Florida, and Kurt Weinmiller from Texas. So this gave a broader perspective. There were 7 recommendations that the panel came up with. And what was very interesting in the question and answer session with the State Board was that several of the groups working in different places of California said, well, actually, many of these principles we're already including. So I think it was very useful. It's quite a short report. You can see that either on the State Board or our webpage. So that was an example of a rapid turnaround time. The first, which is listed here, of course, is the BDCP effects analysis review. This was the third phase of the review for BDCP. As of yesterday lunchtime, the report had been downloaded 195 times. So clearly there's a lot of interest in the findings of this panel. What you'll also see when you look at this report, it's really important to look at the report in its entirety and not just pull out one or two of the recommendations. And I'll explain in a moment why that's so important. The other thing which we've been doing with our panels is that as scientists, we're trained to be ultra critical of one another. So you submit a journal article, and of course people don't say this is a great paper. They're outlining all of the flaws in your arguments and your analyses. So we've really been, on something of this magnitude, it's really important to know what's been done well, what's solid, where the uncertainties are, and what's flat out wrong. And I think that this is certainly reflected in this review. The other thing which was very constructive, I think, was the dialogue that occurred between the BDCP scientists and the review panel. And that provides a very interesting record, because I think nothing in the report was a big surprise. And many of those issues had been discussed at length. And particularly, I think the way David Zippen, who was leading the consulting team there, it was just a very frank discussion. Yeah, this is a difficult thing to do. We've struggled with it. Any ideas that you have around these particular topics, we would like to know. And you'll see that reflected in the multiple recommendations in the report. So just to give you a very brief summary, if you haven't had a chance to go through all 70-odd pages of it, the panel said, well, it was much improved over what they saw in the second phase. Secondly, I think the term they used is it's monumental. And they said the fact it is such a monumental study is both its strength and its weakness. The strength is in the broadness of the scope, the ambitiousness in the integrated assessment going right across your multiple species, multiple actions. The weakness of such a monumental effort is that to pull something of this scale together in the time frame means that the way it was organized was sometimes very, very difficult to follow. And you have to jump around the report way beyond the appendix, which was primarily what they'd been asked to review to fully understand what was going on. Another point that I think it's important to recognize is that people are reviewing this as related to BDCP, but this isn't a thumbs up or thumbs down on BDCP at all. The state has clearly made a very, very significant investments in science to get to this point. And whatever happens with BDCP, clearly something bold has got to be undertaken to solve the problems of the Delta. We can't keep picking at the edges and expect things to get better. And so whatever happens, this body of knowledge will be used many decades into the future. The other thing which this panel showed is that, yes, we know a lot, and I think Bruce Herbold was very eloquent when he spoke at the last council meeting about this. It's very easy to get lost in the uncertainty, but we do know an awful lot. What we do know have been the priorities that have been set through the biological opinions, the really high scientific issues over the last 2 decades. The challenges in this review, and I'm sure the BDCP team, they're more than aware of this, is that in order to do a fully integrated assessment, what the panel explained was that it's really hard if you have a very detailed body of science for this part of knowledge over here, but you're having to go through 3 or 4 other steps in order to fully understand the roll-up of the consequences. And then the next bit in the chain, you just simply hasn't had the same investment over the last 2 to 3 decades. There are these gaps in the chain. So there's big uncertainty in that. So their comments were about the roll-up, how we actually quantify uncertainty. This isn't news to anyone. Director Mark Cowan spoke very eloquently you were at that town hall meeting last year. And the third, I think, really big take-home message again is, and we've heard this through the ISB, we've heard it through BDCP, is really we need to put a lot of thought in how we structure science to be responsive to make adaptive management work, and to also decide when we can address some of these uncertainties through adaptive management. And as Professor Wien said from the ISB, there's also some issues there that maybe you don't use adaptive management for. So I think that's just a very big overview. We're still digesting the contents. There's an awful lot written in that review. I thought the panel did a very in-depth effort. So perhaps I'll just stop there if there are any questions about the BDCP review before I go on to the State Board.
Yes, Phil.
Peter, thanks for the report. I think it's important. I pulled out and copied and read the actual report, and I just suggest to you maybe we could get for tomorrow at least the executive summary would be useful to give to the council members who haven't had a chance to read the full report. And I don't think the full report's been in any of our packets yet. Notice, certainly, a web notice, but we tend to lose track of something unless. So just the first 6 pages or whatever, the executive summary would be useful.
Okay, that's great. Is that been out for, 48 hours or something now? So no, we can get you the whole document. It's not... certainly.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are listening to the your report out there online, it's also there available on our webpage if you'd like to download it.
It was released with your cover letter on March 17th.
On Monday,
yeah.
Okay. And then the third type of science review that we have described in the science plan are these workshops. And these function a little differently. First of all, we're doing this 2-part series of workshops at the request of the State Water Resources Control Board. The first one that I reported to you last month was the outflows and related stresses. We're expecting that report to be posted by mid-April for those of you who are waiting for it to come out. We're hoping that this will be as productive as the first panel, but there were just some really good exchanges in that first workshop which we held. And I think there was the best explanation that I've heard given as to why there's no magic single solution, there's no silver bullet to solving the problems of the Delta. It's multiple stresses. We need to be addressing these multiple stresses in order to get a solution. And I think the exchange between staff on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the panel about that issue was just really very well done. So that was the previous report. On April the 16th and 17th, we're holding the second workshop. So the first was related to the outflows and related stresses. The second workshop is on the interior flows of the Delta and related stresses. The chair of this panel will be Professor Steve Monismith from Stanford. You're very well known to most of you, I'm sure. And the lead author, the person who's going to write that summary report on behalf of the panel and make sure it gets done, is Professor Mike Healy, of course, another former lead scientist, and great writer, great synthesizer. So the purpose of these workshops is really to try and outline the kind of information and what is known that will help guide the State Board in making their decisions. And this is really divided into 2 parts. One is that knowledge and information that could go into help any modifications to regulations. And then the second part is related to the implementation. So what sort of special studies, monitoring, what are the main gaps in knowledge? So those are the types of activities we expect to see coming out of the State Board second workshop. Are there any questions on the science reviews? Please feel free to interrupt. If not, I'll keep going.
No questions.
Okay. So now in terms of collaborative science activities, we have 2 activities underway. You've asked to get an update on the interim science action agenda in each meeting. So just very briefly, you'll see there's a 1-page summary that describes what the interim science action agenda is. Just to refresh your memory, the science plan itself, which you received and accepted back in December, describes the concept of One Delta, One Science, how we actually do the business of collaborative science. The Science Action Agenda is the work plan. It will be on a 4-year cycle. To put together a Science Action Agenda, based on our discussions with other large-scale systems, takes at least 2.5 years, and we realize that nobody has the patience for that. So this is why it's called Interim Science Action Agenda, that this is a fast-track process to try and lay out what's being done, what is being done under the science within the Delta. The third part of the science plan is the state of Bay Delta science, which I'll also describe in a moment. So we are still in the process of synthesizing the available work plans from the agencies related to science. In addition to that, we are looking at the various reviews that either we've conducted or others have done, including the National Academies, taking the recommendations of the Independent Science Board over the last couple of years, and trying to put that into a document where we can start a discussion with the larger science community. And the concept of this is one of the items for discussion in the Interagency Implementation Committee. Following any advice direction we receive in that meeting, we're proposing a meeting in early May that will be open to the science community. So again, for all of the scientists out there in the audience or watching this online, please participate and get engaged. The other part of the collaborative science activity is the state of Bay Delta science. This is very important. This is basically a statement of where we are in science right now. If you recall the advice we received from you, we need to do that this year. So this is like the baseline so that we can judge the effectiveness of science from 2014 onwards. This is a close collaboration with the USGS, and we really appreciate some of the support in terms of personnel and other support we're receiving from them. Darcy Austin, who was the primary coordinator of the last State of Bay Delta Science, which was completed in 2008. At the time, she was an employee of the Delta Science program. So the USGS has agreed to allow her to come back and do the same role as we had in the past. In addition to that, we've appointed the editorial board that will give the oversight of the preparation of this large document, and many of the lead authors have already committed. Many of the issues and the findings in the State of Bay Delta Science will be featured throughout the science conference in October, so it's an opportunity to get feedback from the broader science community before this is actually finalized early next year. Okay. So that's the State of Bay Delta Science. If there's no other questions, just yesterday, the latest issue of the online journal, the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal, was published. I haven't had a chance to read that yet, but there's some really interesting papers that cover the scope. And just to highlight a couple of these articles that are particularly interesting. First of all, there's a paper by Richard Howitt, Alan Hannock, Jay Lund, and others looking at agricultural losses from salinity in California's Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. There's also an update of one of the invasive species within the Delta, the Siberian prawn. There's also a policy and program analysis paper related to genetic considerations associated with steelhead reintroductions within the system. And the essay that you heard from in your last meeting when Dr. Herbold came and spoke about the role of tide marsh restoration in fish management, that paper is also in the current edition of the online journal. Before I invite our Sea Grants State Fellow to come down, there's just a couple of other issues I'd like to highlight that are not written. The first thing is that in your last meeting in February, I mentioned the IEP conference, and the California Water and Environmental Modeling Forum annual meeting was actually ongoing during that week. On behalf of the science community for these events, our science conference, if the council members would like to come by for a day at any time, you're always welcome. We'd love to see you there. You come and meet the scientists, listen to what's going on. But these meetings are just incredibly important for the opportunity, one, to connect with your colleagues associated with certain issues, but also to explore, as part of the papers, there's an extensive discussion time. So people will put up papers and ideas, and it's an opportunity to engage in a debate. And one of the really nice things that IEP has done for the last couple of years is for their annual meeting, they will actually develop a summary. And Anka has just finished that this week, so on the IEP webpage. And it's really a very detailed breakdown. What's the take-home message from each of the papers? 1 or 2 sentences. And so very quickly you can look through this 6-page document and really get an update. What are the new exciting developments which have occurred? In addition to that, there's a few things here. I have to smile. The number 2 bullet on the front page, Unite and Think Big, which was a discussion that I had led, just pointing out in other systems where people get together and speak with one voice. The One Delta, One Science concept, what's been created when people get together and say, this is really what we need. This is a big problem. This is how we solve it. And so thank you, Anka, for putting that on the front page. But there were many other updates. The update to the Delta Smelt synthesis, which is a wonderful example of a synthesis activity, of course, immensely important to guiding management actions. In addition to that, your IEP, the science program, and several other groups hosted an evening event where several of the leaders in restoration activities, you got together and had a debate on what are the science priorities related to habitat restoration. And it was a typical meeting where when you get a group of scientists like that together, the owner of the restaurant comes up and says, please, my folks want to go home. Can you leave now? But it was very productive, and they captured very nicely here the big points of the science priorities related to restoration. So that will obviously feed into the interim science action agenda. I think probably I'll stop there, but if you just want to get a snapshot of what's happening, what are the big discoveries in the IEP world, really a very nice document, and well done to Anka and Greg Erickson and many others on the IEP coordinators that led to that. The other item before I pass it over to Mei Ling, I wanted to make a few remarks just about the lead scientist position, with your permission, Chair. And that is, I know there's a couple of new members on the council. And the lead scientist, to my knowledge, is really a very innovative and unique position, the way it's set up. So I thought it was worth spending a few minutes to explain how it happened, how it came about. So this lead scientist position, in federal government terminology, it's a rotator. People come in, usually for a period of time, but it's fixed term. So essentially the lead scientist is on loan from, if it's a federal agency or a university. This position's been around for a long time. It's been there since 2000. But it's really a very unique way of setting it up. The lead scientist either has to be a federal employee on assignment to the USGS, or it has to be an academic from outside the region on appointment to the federal government. And the reason for setting this up is that it provides an independent voice that can speak on behalf of the scientific community in a way that there's no bias or influence from any particular agency, or even fear of retribution, which has happened in other systems around the country and in other branches of science. And so this is really very valuable. I can tell you the position is through the USGS. They take this very, very seriously. They also provide, they don't only pay for this position, but they also provide some pretty significant resources associated with a lead scientist position. The way it's set up, the Delta Reform Act, you gives the mission and role of the lead scientist to basically oversee the Delta Science program. The Independent Science Board is tasked with identifying candidates. You're helping you to make the confirmation of that position, and the actual contract and the hiring goes through the federal government, the USGS. And of course, it's federal government, it goes right to the Federal Ethics Office. So there's an awful lot of checks and balances, and my activities I report regularly. There's a lot of restrictions on what I can and cannot do in this position. The reporting of the lead scientist, as well as to the council, is to the deputy regional director now of the USGS. This is working very, very well. Jeff Kay and the new director, Mark, are both extremely supportive of the role. So I just wanted to highlight that, yes, this is a rotating position. And you're talking to Lauren and Rainer recently, and having been on the search committee of the ISB in the past, it's not an easy position to fill, and in the past it's taken up to 2 years to find a suitable candidate that's been acceptable to the council. And so the request that I would make, my institution recognizes the importance of this. The University of Idaho has been very supportive. Legally, they're only required to give me a 2-year leave of absence. There's usually a 3rd year negotiable, and then after that, if you're in the university world, you move into a totally different realm. But the university is extremely supportive of this. They recognized it's of service to both California and the United States. But given that it's going to take a long time, and to ensure that we don't have a gap, as has happened in the past between lead scientists, you basically, their institution saying, no, you need to be back on a certain date, and then the next lead scientist coming in, I would ask that the council consider inviting the ISB to start the search committee. There's no rush to do this, but so that you proceed in a manner where there's no pressure to hire. You can be sure that you're getting the right person to move into the position. The last thing that I would suggest that the council gives recommendation to, because whether you're coming out of a federal government or a university, if you want someone who's really active in their institution and national issues, there's a lot of responsibilities associated with that. So I would strongly encourage you to think about just a continuous rolling process. Where the ISB, that's part of their mission, because many people might say, well, I'd love to do this, but for the next 3 years, I've just got a $20 million grant. I'm working in 10 different countries. Love to do it, but 3 years in the future. So then those people drop off the radar screen. But if people are thinking about it as a possibility into the future, I think it would make it a lot easier to hire in the future. So I think maybe I'll stop there. I don't know if there's any other questions about lead scientist or other things.
Well, Peter, I just wanted to thank you for explaining the history of the lead science position and some of the conditions associated with that, and to let the council know that I've had the opportunity to meet with USGS folks, with the Independent Science Board, in support of Peter's suggestion that we enlist the help of the Independent Science Board. And I, having evaluated the situation, fully concur that there needs to be a succession planning process in place. Peter didn't think it was so important prior to becoming the lead scientist, but now that he is in the position and realizes that until a replacement is found, he's kind of on the hook. Now he thinks that succession planning is a really good idea. And as you recall, Cliff Dahm, the previous lead scientist, ended up serving more than 3 years. So, Peter, we respect the situation. We are thankful to the university for providing you the opportunity to serve here, but we also want to follow through on your wishes and recommendation to find a successor. So, any other comments or questions regarding anything that Peter's provided today? It's been a very busy month of science, and thank you for that very complete report.
Okay. And actually, I have one more.
One more.
Sorry. Actually, I'd just like